Hi, I'm George Yancey. Let's share some paradigms. And the paradigm I share today concerns race or politics. What I want to talk about is our racial attitudes. You see, something interesting has happened for the past few years as I've studied racial attitudes. Probably not too long ago, racial attitudes are shaped by our racial identity. Makes sense. If you're an African American or Hispanic American or even a European American, racial attitudes was about what would be good for you and your group. Now, we can think about this as being selfish, as, only think about you and your kind, and that's fair. That's a fair argument to make. But it made more sense why we were divided in our racial attitudes by race, and we still are. I'll be very clear. It's still the case that European Americans tend to have different racial attitudes than other racial groups. However, as I've looked at the data, something clearly has popped out at me. And that is that our racial identity is not the important factor concerning our racial attitudes. The most important factor is our political attitudes. In fact, one of the interesting things is if you look at white progressives, and you want to think about progressive racial attitudes as racial attitudes that are more supportive of people of color, affirmative action or hate crimes legislation or immigration legislation, what you will find is white progressives are more racially progressives than people of color in general. More than African Americans, Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans, so forth and so on. Why? Because political attitudes matter more than racial attitudes. Now, in one sense, this could be a good thing, right? I mean, think about it this way. Today, we know that when it comes to dating or getting involved romantically, that a person's race is less important than a person's politics. People are more willing to date outside their race than outside their political beliefs. And there's nothing wrong saying yay to that. I remember not too long ago that was not the case. That the case was that your race mattered a lot more than your political beliefs and even your religious beliefs. So let's cheer that on. But there's also an implication to this that I find disturbing. You see, we're a very racially polarized society today. There's no doubt about that. And given this polarization, when we tie our racial attitudes to our political differences, we are making it harder to find agreement. I find a disturbing trend among people who are very engaged in politics is that they don't see others who disagree with them as merely wrong. They're tending to see them as evil. People must be defeated. People we can dehumanize. So now, when we tie our racial attitudes to that type of political polarization, what happens? What happens is when I disagree with you, it's not just about what I want as an African American person or you want as whatever race you are. It's also about a political ideology that perhaps you want rejecting me or I want rejecting you. And we can't find agreement on racial issues because we feel like we have to compromise on these deep political disagreements that we have. We have to mend these political wounds that's been inflicted in this racially polarized society. And that makes the conversation all the more difficult to have. I despair a little bit by this sort of tying of racial attitudes to political ideology. I feel that we could get headway in our conversations if we could, at least on racial issues, drop the political ideology and just deal with the morality of race. The big problem we have is that historically, we've had a history of racial abuse. But today, and thankfully, a lot of those mechanisms have gone away so that we don't have overt racism the way we used to have. What do we do with that? To me, that's a big moral question. Questions of justice, of historical justice, questions of equality. Today we treat people without this sort of overt racism. So one group argues, well, what about equality? What about treating everyone the same, including European Americans? Now, I think that those are important moral issues to have. And if we could struggle on that level, just talking about how do we deal with our reality in a moral sense, in a sense of justice, in a sense where we hear everyone out, we could get there. I believe we could get there. But then when the politics gets involved, and now I have to treat you as an R or a D, and you have this position as an R or a D, therefore I must reject it, and the position must be evil, I don't have to consider it. You can see how that makes it harder to find an agreement. So while I rejoice that we're not looking at race in the way that we did 30, 40 years ago, where we're not using racial epithets the way we used to, or we're not dehumanizing people based on their racial identity the way we used to, not to the same degree. It disheartens me that we've attached this political ideology to our race, to our racial issues, and it makes it more unlikely we're going to find agreement and move forward as a society. We must deal with our political polarization, or we must decouple the racial discussion to our political discussions if we're going to be able to use a collaborative conversation approach to address the racial hurt and the racial alienation in our society. I don't have a solution for this other than to call attention to this and then hope that we can think thoughtfully about how we can move forward in this political polarizing society. Does that share some paradigms? Paradigms about race and how the coupling of it to politics makes things harder? Well, think about that, and I hope that this gives you some food for thought. And if it does, and you like these sort of comments, look at more of my videos. Consider subscribing. If you like this, please leave a like, leave a comment. If you don't like it, leave a comment. That's fine. Let's have a discussion. Well, thanks once again. And please come back. We can shatter some more paradigms.